Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy podcast. This is episode 200, Expanding the Boundaries of Choral Music with Katerina Gimon. Standard music notation that is now used ubiquitously around the world does some things really well, but it also has limitations. Katerina Gimon is a composer who actively works to dream up new ways to use notation to communicate sound ideas to musicians that expand our written music vocabulary. Katerina first exploded onto the choral scene in 2019 in a burst of flame, so to speak. Her piece Fire, from the song cycle entitled Elements, was performed by the Vancouver Youth Choir at ACDA that year. I was in the room. I was a little bit off to the conductor's right. I remember it very, very well. That piece and the performance from the group pinned me to the back of my chair. When it was over, I wasn't sure how to describe what I had just heard. I just knew that I loved it. For the rest of 2019, that piece exploded, being performed by choirs all over the place. And then, a year later, the choir world closed for business during the pandemic. Katerina joins me to talk about this time of her life on this Oxford Series episode to discover the very strange trajectory that resulted for her over the start of her career. Typically, if a composer has a big, high-profile success like that, it is immediately followed up by more opportunities to create, commissions, new choirs seeking to collaborate. But in many ways, that moment was frozen in time for her. We discussed the fears that resulted, including, what if I'm going to be a one-hit wonder, as well as her path towards a more holistic, fulfilling career now as a full-time composer with a rich and varied catalog. We also banter about ideas related to Western notation and how it can and should evolve through innovation, like the written languages of every other spoken language on the planet, and expanding use of symbol and sound palettes that were not available to musicians with notation in previous generations. This is a really interesting conversation and a really fun conversation, so I hope you'll stick around and have your thinking stimulated and challenged as always, and then weigh in yourself on the Facebook page called Choralosophers, or over on the Choralosophy community, which can be found at choralosophy.substack.com. Calling all concert planners, let's talk about Ludus. It's more than just a ticketing platform. It's a game changer for event management. Picture this: simplified ticketing, seamless marketing, powerful fundraising, and now, brand new this year, volunteer management. All for free to you and your organization. Thousands of organizations trust Ludus, and you should too. Elevate your events with Ludus. Sign up at ludus.com/choralosophy today and experience the difference. Before we get there, don't forget to support this show because it dies without you. Listen as much as you can. Use the Choralosophy checkout code at graphitepublishing.com, endeavormusicpublishing.com, Sight Reading Factory, and My Music folders. And if you really find this show useful, I hope you will help me crack over the 200 mark of paid supporters who chip in voluntarily either on Patreon or Substack. Just search Choralosophy on either platform to get signed up and keep this show going into the future. The producers and Inner Circle at Patreon are Brannigan Lawrence, Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, Jonah Clicksbull, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, DF, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kakachik.
I mean, I assume if it's okay, 'cause this is an informal conversation, if I drink water along the way and whatnot.
I will be drinking whiskey, so yes.
Whiskey? Oh, okay. I guess it's what time is it where you are?
It's 6 p.m.
Okay, so I'm not quite there yet. It's 4:03 for me, so it's getting there, but not quite. So.
Okay, everybody, I am here with Katerina Gimon, composer, songwriter, and we're about to hear about all the other things that Katerina is. In this conversation, I'm really excited to talk about her career and her approach, and even some thoughts about Western notation itself, which is something that we talk about actually surprisingly a lot on this show. So, Katerina, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is going to be fun. Tell us first, just who are you? Where in the world do you do what you do, and kind of what got you there?
Yeah, so right now I'm living just outside of Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada, but I was actually born and raised on the other side of Canada in Burlington, Ontario, which is sort of outer edge of the Greater Toronto area. And important things to know about me: I'm part of a very proud Ukrainian Canadian family. For those who are watching it, I got my proud earrings on right now. So that was always very important for me. I was always very interested in music. I started taking singing and piano at quite a young age, but things never really clicked for me until I joined this wonderful local children's choir called the Hamilton Children's Choir. And it's like a little Canadian gem, this little choir that all the sort of Canadians know about. And I didn't realize when I joined this choir how good the choir was, but we had this fantastic conductor. Her name is Zemfira Polo. She's quite well known in the children's choir world. And she had just moved to Canada, and this was sort of her first children's choir job. And what that choir did for me is it really exposed me to such a weird and wonderful array of music at such a young age before I knew to be, scared of it or weirded out or anything. And it just really expanded my horizons, with all the music I learned as part of the tours and all the kinds of things we did. So those are the couple first important things. After that, I went on to study music in university. My original thought thinking that I would just do a general music degree and eventually do arts admin. And of course, that didn't really turn out. I ended up loving composition so much. I took my first composition elective in first year that I switched into the composition program. And, one thing leads to the next. And I'm doing a master degree out here in British Columbia. And I've been out here ever since. Important things since then. Basically, I graduated in 2017. I did part-time arts admin for a little bit as I built up my career. And then in 2019, I took the plunge and I decided to do full-time freelance composer. And I didn't even get a full year of what might be the normal world. And it's sort of been a wild ride since then. And I love every minute. There's been new challenges every day. I never know what's going to happen. But I think that's part of the fun and part of the joy of it. And, today I'm still freelancing it, writing all kinds of music, mostly choral music these days, but also music with orchestra. I also do a lot of work with music technology. I have a mixed media ensemble that does like explorations into how we can incorporate, AR and VR and mixed reality into the kinds of things we do. So that's just a touch on the couple
That's
different things I
cool.
do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool. So, with the jump into the full time you talked about in 2019, that's that is after that's quite a few years after Fire, which is the piece that
Yes.
kind of everybody knew you from first, right? And so, fill in the gap because what year was Fire released?
I wrote Fire. So I have to do the math here. This March that just passed was the
Yep.
10-year anniversary of the premiere, but I wrote it about 2 years before. So I think I was about 19, 20 when I wrote that. What year would that have been? 2012, 2013
Okay.
when I
Okay.
wrote that. Yeah.
Right. And so then, of course, that piece does really well and like bursts out. But then fill in the gap then from that moment to then finally saying, "Hey, this is actually going to be my job." So you have this early success, and how does that
Hmm.
lead 5 or 6 years later to full time?
Well, Fire is sort of a weird, and Elements was sort of a weird beast because I wrote that, I mean, as you know, while I was in school, so early in my journey. It was my second ever choral piece that I'd written. Um, And it took a couple of years for it to get published. So this was written 2013 or 2012, 2013, premiered in 2014. I think in 2016, it eventually got published. Carrie Tennant ended up discovering it and including it as part of her series. And that was my first publication. And then from there, it really started getting out there. Um, I got sidetracked. Can you remind me of your question?
No, so what I was interested in is so that gives you this burst of instant success or early success, I
Mhm.
should say. Um, then what happens for 5 years between then and like so did you do other stuff and try to do other things for a living and then come back to composing or were you just slowly building towards that full time?
Well, I was composing the whole time, but I was in school. So the funny thing is, I mean, it was an early success, but people didn't really start figuring out that that piece existed for a while because it
Mm,
took some time for it to get into the world between the publication and the fact that I think nobody knew who I was. But once it did, things really took off in 2019, which you'll notice is the year that I went full-time freelance. And what
right.
happened in that year was, nobody really knew me. I had this one publication, and Carrie Tennant approached me. At that time, I had just moved to Vancouver, and she said, "Hey, just so you know, Vancouver Youth Choir got accepted to perform at ACDAs in Kansas City. Have you heard of ACDAs?" And I was like, "No, I have no idea what that is." And she's like, "Oh, it's sort of a big deal. You should probably come." So I ended up, on a whim, taking a trip and rooming with Carrie at ACDAs. And it was incredible. I don't know if you were there for that.
I was.
Yeah, it was like, the house came down. It was such this weird feeling because I mean, I'd been doing part-time work, I'd been writing in school, but I hadn't really up until that point thought about, how a career could play out. And that was sort of the first moment that I was like, hey, maybe this could happen. And immediately after that, I think up to that point, I had one or two big girl commissions, I'll call it, where I got paid. And
Hmm.
after that point, things started happening so fast. I got a full plate. And by September, I said to my arts admin job, I can't do this anymore. I have to basically tape the plunge. So I took a risk because I didn't know what was going to happen. But it was really the momentum of that important performance that really got it out into the world and sent that spark for a work that, had existed for a little bit up until that point, but people didn't know that it existed. So.
Right. Yeah. So what's it like then to have um, almost like a feat that's hard to top be your first thing? Do you know what I mean? Like how does that affect you as an artist, and how do you process that?
Terrifying. It
Yeah.
is absolutely terrifying. And I mean, there's been a lot of things I've had to learn, I think, because of that, because so many people, and even still today, only know me for that piece, or that's what they think of me. It's been, at sometimes, uh, I feel almost like it's pigeonholed me, and I've really had to push against and really try to actively say, hey, I can do other kinds of music, whether that be different mediums or different styles, and I've had people say to me, like, even in, like, I've done a couple conferences this year and they heard other things of mine. They're like, wow, your other music sounds nothing like fire. And I'm like, I know.
Yeah.
That was one piece of mine very early in my career. And I really think about all of the music that I write. It's really a time capsule of who I am at a certain point in time. It's like my little baby at, that was 19, 20-year-old cat. And those are the things I was interested in at that point. But every artist's journey and every composer, it continually evolves and it grows and changes. And so I think pushing against that has been sort of something that I've had to really, really work towards, for myself as an artist, and also to learn that to push against, for example, and this is a conversation that I have with a number of composer friends since then. At first, my first commissions passed that. So I talked about 2019 and when things sort of changed for me. I got a lot of commissions. I was super happy and I ran into it and I set myself up for failure because a lot of people said, can you write another fire? And I
Hmm.
didn't know,
Hmm.
well, I hadn't thought too much about it, but if you try to recreate a piece, it's never going to work out. I can never write another fire. And I think it took some time for me to realize, because I was so early in my artistic journey, that, when people say that, they mean more, I want something rhythmic, and you should take your own spin on it and change it around, because you can never recreate a piece. And if you're trying to do that, then it's never going to work out. So there's been learning curves, I think, especially, in those senses.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder too. It's almost I've seen interviews with famous Hollywood actors too, who kind of maybe they're known for just like the one role, and I've heard them talk about how just anxiety inducing that is because of the desire to break out of that box and want to be seen for something else, but at the same time have conflicted feelings because they're like, well, I'm sure glad I had that role because it gave me the career that I have. Do you feel that internal conflict at all?
Yes. So much. Because I mean, at the same time, I feel incredibly privileged and lucky that the piece connected with so many people and that it took off so much that I was able to do what I do. And, I feel like it's definitely, like you said, been an internal struggle, because I'm like, oh, but I want to do other things. But am I being ungrateful if I'm like, no, I don't want to do that again?
Hmm.
You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's such a strange and weird and, again, lucky position that I'm able to be in. But I think something that a lot of us don't think about when it comes with, like, I don't want to call it a quick success, because I mean, as I sort of told in my story, it had been permeating for a number of years, but something that I think in the eyes of the world was sort of fast. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I wonder too. I mean, I don't want to get all conspiratorial here either, but I wonder if the pandemic happening when it happened also could have helped cause some of that pigeonholing. You're nodding. People on the
A
video can't
hundred
see.
percent.
Like,
I forgot to say that, but when I was pondering about, about that the other day, I think that's a huge part of it because I mean, you'll notice the timing there. My career
yeah,
started really 2019. This big hit took off. And then, of course, I was writing a lot, but no one was hearing anything new because, of course, you need to have premieres and recordings before anyone heard that.
right,
So all that people were hearing from me was those popular early pieces, which sort of I think ended up extending that feeling even more so, which means, 10 years after, over 10 years since I wrote that work, still that's what most people know me for. And I still really have to try so hard to push against that and to, sort of try and expand my horizons as an artist and figure out other ways I can do that. And I mean, on the other side of things, people might notice now I have so much coming out. And a
right.
huge part of the reason is, I mean, I've been writing the whole time. I'm not the only composer, but I feel like for me, especially because my career was really just sort of in this pivotal moment when it happened, it's sort of like I held back the floodgates as I wrote all these pieces and they're all coming out now. So
Yeah. So what was it like during the pandemic, having this rush of success and then having to shut it down, basically?
Well, I think like for anyone, it was extremely heartbreaking. One of the
Hmm.
things that I was looking forward to the most was I was supposed to have a premiere at the World Symposium on Choral Music in New Zealand, summer 2020 in
Hmm.
Auckland. And it was, the biggest thing I had ever done. I wrote a brand new piece and it was supposed to go out there. And I remember, I mean, the world is shutting down and I'm obviously everyone's so upset about everything that's happening, but sitting there and crying, literally crying and thinking, I was just getting to a point where maybe I could have made something of myself. And now I don't know if that's something I'll ever get to do again, and I think we all had those feelings in one way or
Right.
another, but just wondering if all I had was all I was going to ever had was such a scary feeling. Because I was just taking, my baby steps in that. It was terrifying. And I think there were some positives from many people, including myself. And I found a really wonderful community of composers that I sort of connected with during the pandemic. Before then, I was a little more isolated, I will say, because I was sort of just starting to get to know people. But I think the connections and the virtual connections that started happening over the pandemic ended up actually in the end expanding my horizons because I connected with people in the Canadian choral community. I connected with amazing mentors like, Andrea Ramsey, Justin Hagen, who I know you've had on the show as well, and all these fantastic people that ended up really being able to help me through sort of that difficult next stage of my career and really uplift me as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, I was like I said before when we were talking about the ACDA performance in Kansas City. I was there. It's 30 minutes from my house, so it was easy for me to get there. And I remember that Carrie's performance of that piece there too. And I just remember thinking that never really heard anything like that. And I'm old, so I've heard a lot of things. And so it was an incredible experience. And I wonder too, just kind of to touch on that conspiracy theory again. But correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't they make a pretty good video of that too? That like was on YouTube and right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they
So
had an incredible video and then it ended up getting taken further later because it went TikTok viral by another group.
yes, that's
Yes.
it. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just wonder too, because like for that next year or two, 2020, 2021, that was almost that was choir was just YouTube videos
Yeah.
and viral videos because they weren't meeting. And so it's almost like it froze that moment in time and
Mhm.
then just stretched it out over over 2 years, even though nobody,
Exactly.
I don't know. I know it must be weird that I'm like micromanaging your life here, but thoughts about that?
Oh, well, I felt like I mean, I love the piece, but I feel like if I tried to equate it to life, it was like I was stuck in my awkward teenager phase for like 5 years.
Yeah,
Because I wasn't
that's
allowed to move on
uh-huh.
because we were just there. And of course, again, I don't want to say like I love that piece. It's such a cool piece. But
Yeah,
as an artist, you want to be able to grow and change and showcase. And it was just like, this isn't all I am. And it, compounded all those feelings that we were talking about. And I think helped, well, it it sowed, I won't say helped, it made and sowed that feeling of imposter syndrome within me even more so because of course, you know, in my sane moments, I'm like, I do know what I'm doing. I do know how to compose. I have a lot to say, but, you know, isolation plus pandemic plus all of this, you can't help but think, am I ever gonna, is this all I'm ever gonna do? Will I write another piece, or is this it? Is this
Right.
all I have to say?
Right. But of course, we have come out the other side of it. You're doing a
Mhm.
lot of amazing stuff now. What is life like now, and in terms of creating music? And are you getting to express the things that you feel like were, squelched for a couple of years?
Yes, so much. And it's been so exciting. And I think it's taken some time to get there, obviously, but I have been doing a lot more collaborative work, which I'm super, super happy about. I often write my own lyrics, but I also love to collaborate with living poets. So I have a number of sort of poets I've connected with over the years. I'm doing a lot more environmental activism work as well, which is something I've always been interested in, but I've been diving into more and more, and into some of my more recent works. Mixed media things, like I talked about a little bit, is something I also got to dive into a little bit more, especially during the pandemic when I didn't
Hmm.
have live choir things happening. Um, I've been expanding more into the world of orchestral music, which I've been very lucky to be able to do. I never thought that, sparking a career in choral music would have led me there, but it's been terrifying and wonderful to try my way in that world as well. So, and
Yeah.
I wrote two operas as well, so I've been busy.
Oh wow, two
Yeah.
two operas.
Yeah.
Have they had premieres as well?
The first one has had a, I guess, unofficial, like unstaged premiere. So we're doing
Okay.
like a long development period, and the other one has premiered. They're chamber operas, I should clarify. So like 25 minutes.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. Now this episode is going to be partially blasted out and promoted by Oxford Press. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Oxford?
Yeah.
So that's a relatively recent thing, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, so the piece that just came out with Oxford, and I should say, because I'm so happy, I'm going to celebrate this with all you folks. Um, this piece, Come Back Like the Sea, is my first J.W. Pepper Editor's Choice for an original work of mine, which is super, super exciting milestone for me.
I hope it
And
sounds just like fire.
it
I'm
sounds
I'm
nothing like
kidding.
fire.
I'm kidding.
It's so funny that we're talking about that because yeah, it sounds absolutely nothing like fire, but it's very me, but at a different place in the emotional spectrum and creative spectrum and everything. I mean, actually, it's funny. It could probably not be any more different than fire, but it's still awesome, and I love it so much. It's for SSATB. And that's probably the closest actually thing to fire, is that it's sort of the same voicing, but there's piano. There's piano
Okay.
as well, and it's a setting of a Sarah Teasdale text. And the text is, just permeated with this beautiful ocean sea imagery. And of course, growing it's rainy today, but I live on the West Coast. So ocean, mountains and all that obviously, really, really connect with me. But also the idea of impermanence is something that she really plays with in the text. And she describes the how, basically the inevitable ups and downs in our lives, this is also a nice circle because we were talking about that a second ago, are like the rise and fall of the sea tide. And so the piece has this really nice kind of like rocking kind of feeling towards the beginning, but by the end, it's like this really beautiful, passionate kind of exhale, to get to this moment of realizing that, we'll make it through. We always do. And there's always a better day coming, essentially. So.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's
Mhm.
that. I'm gonna have to take a look at the piece for next year for one of my groups, because we're here in Missouri where Sarah Teasdale's from, so we'll have to check that out.
Oh, really? Oh, I
Yeah.
didn't make that connection. Okay, yeah.
Hmm.
So you'll definitely have to do it. And that piece, the other nice thing about it is Oxford has categorized it as easy, which is nice. So it's like 2 out of 4 of their dots or whatever. So
Okay.
not too much DVZ. It's actually more accessible than most of my stuff as well too, but still so, so stunning. I'm so proud of it. And I love the piano part. I don't know who plays your piano, but the pianist will have lots of fun.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I'm speaking of your broader catalog now. Now that we've expanded past that, your first piece,
Mhm.
um, how would you describe your catalog to someone? Or if you were to say, for example, we know that with some of your early stuff, you did a lot of, I guess, non-traditional notation, and I'm sure that that is not something you've given up on. You still have that aspect to your composing as well. How do you describe that to people if they say, "Hey, what kind of music do you write?" Like
If
at
I'm
the
just talking,
airport bar, like we're at the
yeah.
airport bar, and somebody asks.
Basically, I say, I write choral music, but not what you think.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Because I mean, it's not at all what people expect. I mean, with all of my influences, I guess I forgot to mention this when I was talking about my background. There's so many little things, but I really started my journey, my writing journey, my creative journey as a songwriter for, as long as I can remember. I always wrote songs. When I was really little, I thought there was just me being bad at my piano lessons. When I got older, I was a songwriter.
Right.
And
Right.
then I only started really writing the classical realm once I got to university. So, anyways, circling back to our conversation now, um, the graphics are something that I think always drew me in because it was this beautiful connecting piece between the world of, folk singer songwriter improvisation in that songwriting world, folk music of, my Ukrainian Canadian heritage, pop music, and all these things, which are more um, performance based and listening based, and also have different kinds of what's the word, like ornamentations and
Yeah.
stylistic things that are hard to convey in our system of Western notation that was really built for church music, of a certain era. It
Right.
got so good at showing things for a certain style. But if you want to break out of that, my music will one either look terrifying, which happens, in general for a lot of contemporary composers when you're bringing
Uh,
in other styles, or you have a giant box and asterisks where you're trying to explain what you want because it doesn't really fit. And so a lot of my early stuff, you'll notice, is already breaking out of that box, and the connecting pieces of the songwriting world and all those earlier things that I came into that started there. And the more and more I've done it, I think I've just sort of refined my process to figure out when is Western notation best and clearest to show something I want to do, and when is it lacking and better for me to sort of marry the aspects of graphic scorings, visuals in some sort, and Western notation,
right.
which is sort of more of the world that I live in right now, where I tend to use both.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it. Now I have. I want to pick your brain about this because this is something that I'm a huge nerd about. So I'm gonna float an idea, and I want you to see what you think. So I don't really agree with the way you describe Western notation, but don't freak out. It's not a big.
It's okay. It's
It's not a
okay.
scary disagreement. And here, because I have this weird thing that I've been working on the show and also in my personal life, and like trying to talk to like smart people to try to come up with this theory. But I just really believe that music functions in our brain like a language, like any other language, neurologically, but also it's just a way more complicated language than all the other languages. And so when we're talking about Western notation, what I think about it would be like there is no there is no Western notation as if it's like one thing, because then I could just say, well, like from what year? Western notation
That's
from
true.
1400s or from 1565 or from 1700s, or it's an evolving way of writing down music that, oh by the way, so is writing down every other language,
Mhm.
gradually evolving over time. And so what I think is really interesting about your music, when you say you're doing both, what I say is that you're just writing down music, but you're evolving the written language. You're causing it to evolve
Ah.
the same way other languages have written out. Like we have letters now that we didn't used to have 1,500 years ago, and somebody made up the new letters because they represented sounds that weren't being represented
Hmm.
in the language. So in that sense, when we say, well, Western notation is so limited, like, well,
It's
yeah,
evolving.
it is, but then let's evolve it. Thoughts?
Mhm. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I 100% like that because I mean, it's true. If you think about, I'm talking about graphic notation as these two separate worlds now and trying to collide it in my music. And I think you're
Hmm.
right. What I'm talking about is the snapshot. I think of what we're imagining,
Yeah.
as if I didn't do those kinds of things and didn't involve those kinds of influences. But truth be told, like you said, if we went back, 700 years or so, I think that's about right, if I'm doing my math correct. If we're looking at Noom notation, our earliest form of what
Hmm.
eventually led to what we're using today, that could be considered graphic notation.
Yeah. Oh,
That's just
absolutely.
to most people, it would just look like a vague series of squiggles, which is graphic notation. And it's
Mhm.
just that evolution, like you said. So I actually like that because then it shows the evolution and how our system develops and changes. And I think we're, now that we're getting to this place now where we're exploring, including so many more things, I think there's some growing pains, which
Yeah.
is what I really try to address in a lot of the music that I do. I obviously, I can't solve it all, and I'm constantly learning from, my peers and other composers as well when I see it. But it's always this funny struggle as a composer because you know what you want, and then I write it down and I'm like, that looks horrible.
Right.
With your twos against threes and everything. And it feels so natural if it's got, a poppy vibe or whatever. But then it's always, how do we make it look clear, and get it communicated to the people that are learning it in the best way possible?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's that is really good and it's important. And I think with the notation aspect of it, like why does this cause us this challenge, this barrier? One of the things I like to think about is just there are certain building blocks of the I will say Western notation, even though as we discussed, I don't like the term. Um, but in that system, it's hard to come up with, and many people have tried. It's hard to come up with a better way to show that we want four G naturals in a row, evenly spaced across time, and we want four of them, recycling over. Like there are certain. It's very we've the way we do that in Western notation is pretty hard to beat. Like
Yeah.
that's what should happen. And so there are things about it that are really good. It's a really good way to show that I want certain pitches in a well tempered, etc.
Mhm.
But like you've been pointing out, and like you're demonstrating in a lot of your music, where do we go then when that system runs out of ways to inform the musician on the other end, right?
Mhm.
And so, if you could just as because I want to peek inside of your brain a little bit, what are some examples of types of sounds that you've like just gotten fits over how to communicate it to the like that you really struggled trying to communicate to choirs or singers or whatever?
Um, I'll have to think about what gave me a fit. But one thing that I always use as an example when I'm sort of talking about this kinds of thing with, composition students or people in the choral world is, um, for example, if I wanted to, and this is something I do in a lot of my music, if I wanted to have all the singers sing on a pitch and then repeat a set of words, I could say, for example, I want everyone to repeat the words "I am a ripple" on a pitch. I am a ripple, I am a ripple, and just change the rhythm, change the pacing as they go. I
Mm-hmm.
could, and again, I'm putting some quotations because I can't think of a better term. In Western notation, I could
Mm-hmm.
divide that into 72 lines and I could write everyone a different rhythm and have a million divisi.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can find a way to depict that in graphic notation where you write it, you have the pitch, you have the text, and then you have a graphic to help describe that. So
Mm-hmm.
that has become less of a headache for me now that I've described or figured out how to do it. But that is something that began as a headache for me, I guess, now that I think about it, when I wrote Elements, because that was one of the first times I explored doing things like that. And part of the reason why there was this period between it getting written and premiered and making its way into the world is because I was so early in my career. And I had lived in this singer-songwriter world that the piece existed for a long time just in my DAW as a recording of me singing it. And then it took a really, really long time for me to figure out how to write it down. Um, and that earliest version was actually entirely handwritten. And
Right.
it took several more years for me to be experienced enough with notation software to know how to break it enough to actually get there. So years later, now the version that people are looking at is like version 2.0 when I finally figured it out. But um, it's a process.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's one example that comes to mind of something that I think it just makes more sense. It's probably clearer and less overwhelming to look at a page to do something like that, and will achieve the fact we're not being stressed about having the exact rhythm. Because the truth be told, in some cases like that, it doesn't really matter to the composer. You're going to hear the same overall effect, whether everyone has like a very precise rhythm divided into 72 or not. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. And will the audience even know? Will caring about the minutia of those types of details end up hindering the experience for everyone? Those are all the balances that we always have to consider.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, as somebody who, so my first degree was in composition improvisation. So I did a lot of work in the improvisation world as well, and exploring that myself, and as well as exploring, really wildly notated contemporary music really helps sort of me figure out a little bit more, when is it better to do one versus the other? What is the purpose that one serves versus the other? And to figure out the type of composer I am, which is that I tend to lean towards giving my performers more autonomy so they can live in the moment, and have those rare moments that I feel like we have nowadays where we're completely there. Which I think is a lot easier to have than when you're stressing
Yeah.
about trying to do something so exact. So,
Well, I wonder too, how much have you thought about the way technology is changing as a way to help you communicate these things to the musicians? Is that something that you're really kind of actively pursuing?
uh, do you mean like making recording tracks kind of thing, or just how has it
No.
evolved in my
Well,
process?
I don't know, maybe this is outside of the box, but like I'm thinking like even just the migration, what I think is inevitable, it's just a question of time, but the migration towards just digital sheet music all the time for everything.
Mhm.
And I think it's generationally the people who really just feel like they need paper in their hand is gonna shrink over time. And so I start to think then, okay, so if all sheet music is delivered and even created to be delivered digitally, what types of innovations, like I was talking about before,
Woo!
what types of innovations become possible in how we notate the music? For example, on piece of paper and pen, it's not possible technologically for a certain type of my pen stroke to, I don't know, turn into like a hyperlink that has a sound file embedded in it, that can, that the singer can just press that noise and hear the sound that the composer intended and say, oh, I'm supposed to make that sound.
Oh,
And
I love that.
I'm just thinking, this is like off the top of my head, so I'm just like trying to think about like the technology could not only help our notation system evolve, but it could also help composers like you who are still, in the prime of the spring of your life,
Mhm.
to be able to innovate in that way. Thoughts about that?
I would love that. If someone would hears this and would like to make me a PDF that does that, I know how to put links in, but that's actually really cool because it's true. Because so many people, including myself, work on iPads nowadays.
Yeah.
I've already started, without thinking about it, done simple things like I had a graphic score recently where I used color. And I never used color before in the early years of my career because, nobody's going to print in color. Nobody's going to waste the money. But we've gotten to a point now where I'm like, you know what? In the choirs that I sing in, at least half the people are reading off iPads. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to give them the colors so they can experience it and see the piece in a different way and sort of have that heightened experience through that. Might
Yeah.
as well. So something as simple as that, but I like the idea of hyperlinks as well within the score because not only are you getting, the note, but it's click here and you
Hmm.
can listen. I would love it if it popped up in the score. That would be really cool. Sort of like an interactive and you didn't have to leave it.
Yeah. Oh,
But
yeah.
that would be so cool. And I mean, I've done other scores as well. This is less in the choral world, but in more in like the contemporary chamber world where you have like timers built into the piece where you use like
Hmm.
max patches and whatnot. So, I mean, that kind of thing could be really cool too if you have sections of aleatory and you could find a way to, I'm getting crazy now.
No, it's great.
You could have a way to sync it. So you're all looking at your score and the conductor starts you and I have 20 seconds to do this and you're all in the same timer because then you have options to see how long a section's going. Maybe you can even distance yourself if you're doing a performance outside or doing something spatially, which I love to do, I'm sure,
Right.
because of elements. It opens up a lot of really cool doors, I think, for I think what could be possible going forward. Ooh, I'm excited now.
Yeah. It really is. I just think, um, I very strongly believe that we will not be writing music in the same way that is recognizable to us now in 100 years. Like
Mhm.
it just that would be an historically illiterate thing to believe that would happen because if you go 100 years ago, music looked very different on the page.
Yeah.
So why would it stay the same now? And that's actually a currency bias that humans tend to have in general. Like we just tend to believe that our way is the way, and
Yep.
and it will always always be, no, it'll always be so. So I'm really interested in it because I'm also very nerdy. Like I really go into the science of how kids learn how to read music. And
Yeah.
because I've done a lot of studying about that and how it's connected to reading of other languages, I think about this experimental stuff. And of course there are other
Mhm.
composers outside of Katerina Gimon that are,
Mhm.
experimenting with these things. But I think about the role you guys are playing in kids developing that same elasticity in their mind of being able to see something on the page that they've never seen before, and try to make sense of it. And I think that is really something that we do when we read all languages. Like when you're reading something
Yeah.
in a novel that just is covering a subject matter that you've never even been encountered before in your life, and you've never heard that type of imagery and that language imagery before, or whatever, your mind can kind of go and expand. And I wonder if you've ever thought about that when you write music, in that, like, oh, I could actually be not only writing music that people enjoy, but I could be expanding their minds. Is that something you think about?
Yes, and I get that a lot when people look at that score, or I come in for workshops to talk about it, and it's super inspiring as someone who, again, feels like I'm still early in this process. But I think what's unique about, elements and fire and a lot of the stuff I've done is I feel like I was, you know, one of the first generations. I think I'm around the same age as Jacob Collier that used DAWs, and like it was really part of my process and what I did. And I think I'm one of the first composer generations that really did that. And that became so important to me. And now seeing, like the next generation, it's so rooted in what they do is just like um the doors it opens up, not only the DAWs, but also connecting that to things like graphic notation, which I talked about, and how we can use that to talk large brushstrokes and shapes and begin there and then zoom in and solve the problems of how do we notate things. So we're never limiting ourselves based on our current knowledge of Western notation, which is
Mm-hmm.
something that I struggled with when I was writing elements. We write what we want to write, and then we figure out how to notate it, instead of the trap that I think many composers tend to fall into, which is that I don't know how to write it, therefore I'll write something that I know how to write.
Mm-hmm.
If I knew I wanted a sound of da 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 da, and I think I started with a staff paper or I started with finale, I never would have written elements.
Mm.
But coming from this other approach, and I think one of the, again, one of the earlier generations that had these kinds of things at their disposal, having to work with my DAW, thinking more visual and graphic based, I think really is what changed it for me. And that is the thing that I'm seeing is the most impactful for especially the younger generations that I'm speaking to, because they are using these things even more than I did. Like I started using it late high school on my shared family computer. And in university, when I got my first computer that had GarageBand on it, I really dove into it. But all of them now, they are like at a level way beyond where I was by the time they're entering university. Even in high school, they're totally fluent. I'm sure you're finding this as a high school teacher as well. They know how to do multi-track recording, all this stuff. And it's so amazing to see even just the connections between that and the type of music I'm writing. So anyways, that was a long-winded
Oh,
answer, but it's cool to see those connections because I think it serves as a gateway and a way for them to say, here's all these things I'm interested in. I can see how maybe they could fit into this world of choral music. So
yeah. Yeah. No, that's really great. And now I have a question. It's kind of a traditional question whenever I talk to
mm,
composers. What is a piece that you've written that you thought was going to get attention but didn't? And this is a two-part question. Or on the flip side of that, and you could choose one or both. On the flip side of that, they're a piece that, like, actually people liked, but you were like, oh, I didn't think anyone was going to like that. In other words, what I'm asking for is, like, have you ever disagreed with your audience, essentially, like where that you thought a piece was awesome and nobody sang it, or vice versa?
probably both. I mean, I've never disagreed like I thought a piece was bad, but like I was very surprised about Elements and Fire.
Okay.
Because I had no idea, like I had no plans or thoughts for it to go out into the world. I thought the things I was creating were cool. I was exploring all the possibilities. I just wanted my university choir to do it. So you can
Mm,
believe me, I was probably the most surprised person in the world who, when Carrie Tennant approached me about putting in her series, because I was like, oh my God, I've never seen anything published like that. There's no way any publisher is going to want to touch that. So the amount of surprise, that is probably number one. I never expected that to happen. I think I understand artistically why people connect with it, but I couldn't have been more surprised that it was the success that it was.
Yeah.
Um, because it was just, it was something that I just wrote without thinking about that. So, although who knows, because I mean, the more and more you talk to artists, that when you have those kind of pieces that write themselves and are authentic and you don't overthink, those tend to be the ones that are the most, from the heart and beautiful in their own way. So there's that. And then the second one, I think my most, I guess I'll say underrated piece is I have this lovely piece that I wrote. When was it? 2019. This is probably why. Now that I'm thinking about it.
Could be.
Yeah, it could be called Beneath Sound. And
Oh, that's the one I did.
yeah, that's the one you did. And not a
Yeah.
lot of people do it. And
Yeah.
I
It's hard.
absolutely, it's hard,
Yeah.
but it's so cool. And
Hmm.
what I really love about that one is it sort of journeys through all these different, really interesting and unique textures. And the way it captures that spatialized poem. So for people who don't know the piece, it's based on a poem, a spatialized poem that is just not actually that many words, but the way it's spaced out on the page, I tried to recreate in the music and the journey in this piece that ended up being like a 6-minute piece, ended up being way longer than I meant for it to be. But
Yeah.
I think it's such a cool evolving journey of colors and sounds and exploration of all the things we can do with our voices. And I love that piece so much. And I'm so sad more people don't do it because I think it's like one of my favorite.
Yes, and
Yeah.
people should check it out. If you've got a
Mhm.
advanced collegiate or high school group, I'll tell you a little bit about our experience since I haven't touched base with you since we did it really.
Mhm.
But when we did it, so this is the mind expanding part I was talking about. When I
Mhm.
put that piece in front of my kids for the first time, they were skeptical, like super skeptical. They were like, "What are you asking us to do? What is this noise? This is not a noise we make in this group," or these types of things. And of course, I just kept plugging away and listened to him gripe, and we just kept plugging away. But by the end, they of course loved it, and they were begging to sing it. We had a concert at the end of the school year, the very end of the school year, in a very resonant kind of almost wet acoustic space that we because of the percussion we
Mhm.
ended up not being able to do it because it
Yeah.
was that wet. Like it was so wet in the room acoustically that like any of the percussion, it was like that was all you could hear was just the drums,
Yeah, I
and
was
then it
just
was like
eating it.
this is not going to work. And the kids were so bummed. They were so bummed because they wanted to do it. So they went from
Oh,
skeptical to like begging to
oh.
do it at the end, And so it's a great piece. And the spatial aspect was one of the things that the kids and I really decided to interpret with
Mhm.
with our performance. So we actually spaced the choir in a weird kind of representative way, especially some of the soprano dissonant duet
Mhm.
things that happen in there. We antiphonally spaced those parts so that they were coming at from different sides of the room. It was really cool, and the kids just loved it. So yeah, I agree. I would agree if that's an underrated piece in your catalog,
It's so
then definitely,
underrated. I don't
yeah.
know why people don't do it. Listen here and go find it. It's so cool.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So this is really fun. I think we could kind of finish on this aspect of what we've been discussing. So if you could take all of these ideas that we're nerding out about, and we've got potential to evolve the written language. We've got the potential to evolve the way young singers and young musicians hear music, and I mean like their definition. I think you mentioned this before. Is like what we expect music to sound like, and what we
Mhm.
expect written music to look like on the page, and all of those types of things. As we continue to evolve those things, what would be your goal? Since you, as we've discussed, you're a young composer. When you are not a young composer, when I'm a really old podcaster and you're an oldish composer, what would be the things that you would hope to achieve with your music specifically and with your art?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Ooh. Hmm.
This is not binding, by the way. You don't.
Yeah. I mean,
If it
I think,
changes,
yeah, I think in general, just knowing that I could serve as a bridge to other things. Because, like you said, and I like that you mentioned the idea of our Western notation system as something evolving. I don't ever want to be the last step in this.
hmm
I feel like maybe what I'm doing is a next step. but I hope to see more and more. And it means so much to me to see, high school students, composers younger than me saying that what I've done, has inspired them to, whether it's try their hand at composition or explore their own types of things they want to notate but didn't know how to in graphic notation. So I think all that I can hope for is to help continue to expand that for others. That would be the ultimate goal for me, I think, as a composer and as an artist, is to know that I provided, I guess, a stepping stone for anyone else in that way.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Mhm.
And any big projects coming up before we sign off?
Two big ones I'll mention. I'm actually in the process of finishing up recording and producing my first album of choral music. It's an
Okay.
album of environmental choral music, and it's going to feature the first full recording of elements. So, because surprisingly, it's been recorded in different movements, but not in full yet.
Oh,
So it's going to
great.
have that, and it's going to have my follow-up to Elements, which is a piece called Unsung. That is a series. It's about 5 pieces, 5 movements, and it's sung from the perspective of landscapes threatened by the climate crisis. So, for example, a melting glacier, and it's so cool and so fun, and explores a lot of these things we were talking about today. And then the last one I'll mention, in case there's any conductors of treble youth choirs listening, I'm doing a concert project with Manhattan Concert Productions next summer. I believe June 24th is the date, and I'm composer in residence for their event. Margaret Clark is the conductor who conducts the Washington Children's Chorus of Washington. And I'm writing a new piece. We're going to be doing Air and Fire. I'm going to be there in person, and I would love, if there's any groups who are thinking about doing a tour next summer and you want to join me, I'm writing a new piece. You'll get to be part of that commissioning experience. So I would love to have groups join me for that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Katerina, thank you for spending some time chatting with me. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, awesome. I appreciate it. Thank you all for listening to this episode. As always, the way that we keep Choralosophy moving into the future. We just hit 5 years, and the way we hit 5 more years and continue to grow and expand, the way that this platform can be valuable to you, the listener, and can continue to be valuable to the music education landscape is you being involved. The ways that you can be involved, of course, are entering the Choralosophy promo code at all the websites that allow that. They are amazing partners that have been with us mostly since the beginning. That's SiteReadingFactory.com, MyMusicFolders.com. That is also EndeavorPublishing.com and GraphitePublishing.com. You can also, of course, go over to Ludus and check out their products. You can do the things directly for the show that help, like go to patreon.com/Choralosophy and chip in $3 a month. And if you can't do any of those things, I just want you to join the conversation. So head on over to the Choralosophers Facebook page, like, share, leave comments anywhere that you're able to see the content. Those help other people see the content and join the conversation as well. We are building a movement here, and we want you to be a part of it. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.